Today we've got Glenn Kirschner, a legal analyst for NBC and MSNBC. He teaches criminal justice at George Washington University, and he's a federal prosecutor with 30 years of experience. Glenn, thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me, Brian.
So I want to talk about the Matt Gaetz situation, and I do want to make this caveat for those watching and listening that so far, Gaetz' involvement is all alleged. And so if I speak about trafficking, please know that it's alleged. I'll try to make that distinction, but I just wanted to issue that disclaimer up front. So with that said, Glenn, could you give us a rundown of Gaetz' situation as it stands right now?
Sure. So one thing is not alleged about what's going on with Matt Gaetz because he and his lawyers confirmed about a week ago, as reported by the New York Times, that the Department of Justice has him as a subject in a child sex trafficking investigation. That's an important word. And frankly, it's not a badge of merit. No, you're not a target of the investigation, but you're a target -1. Here's how the Department of Justice defines subject, because when I would put witnesses in the grand jury, if they were a subject of the investigation, I was required to advise them as follows. Mr. Witness, you understand that you're a subject of the grand jury's investigation. What that means is that your conduct, your potential criminal conduct, falls within the scope of what the grand jury is investigating, and if appropriate, you could be indicted. Do you understand that? And with that understanding, are you still willing to testify even though you are a subject of the investigation? So look, Matt Gaetz is in some pretty deep trouble by all indicators. Now, as you say, he hasn't been charged with a crime yet. But what do we know? We know that his criminal bestie, Joel Greenberg, right, county assessor for Seminole County, Florida, has been indicted for a whole rack of federal crimes, including child sex trafficking. About a week ago, Joel Greenberg woke up with 12 felony charges hanging over his head. That night he went to bed with 33 felony charges hanging over his head because the federal prosecutors in Florida issued a superseding indictment. Now we learned yesterday in a status hearing in Joel Greenberg's case that it looks like a plea deal is in the offing. And if that wasn't ominous enough, a gentleman by the name of, I think it's Fritz Scheller, who is the defense attorney for Joel Greenberg, when he was asked, do you think Matt Gaetz is in trouble? Do you think he should be concerned? He hemmed and he hawed for a while, but then he said, if I were Matt Gaetz, I would not feel comfortable right now. That's pretty ominous. I think we all know that if Joel Greenberg flips, we are likely to see Matt Gaetz indicted.
Now, would the only reason for federal prosecutors to allow a plea deal to be to get a bigger name like, a United States congressman?
So as a career federal prosecutor, if I'm striking a plea deal with somebody, it has to be for an important reason, either because I think that defendant can help me work my way up the food chain to bigger fish, to bigger criminals, or because that plea deal, I have consulted with the victims in the case and we've decided together that that's the right resolution for the victims. It's what the victims want to see happen in the case. So it's not just one reason that we would strike a plea deal. But let me tell you, if we wanted to basically do everything we can within the law to force cooperation, we are not going to let them plead to anything short of all 33 charges. Because if you're going to plead guilty, then I'm not going to give you a break. You have to plead straight up to the indictment, every indicted charge, and then I'm going to go hard at you during the sentencing hearing. So a plea deal, I would say the vast majority of the time, signals cooperation.
Building off of what you just said, if Greenberg was the principal perpetrator here, meaning that he facilitated the trafficking, in theory, he's higher in the food chain of this particular crime. So why allow him to cooperate to ostensibly get to Gaetz? Like, Greenberg might not be a name like Gaetz is, but isn't he a bigger prize for prosecutors since he actually facilitated the alleged trafficking?
We don't know who is the bigger prize because the devil's in the details, and the details are before the grand jury. They're the evidentiary details. So we don't know who facilitated whom. What we do know is that if you're in a conspiracy together and you're both involved or multiple people are involved in child sex trafficking, from where I sit, that alone is enough to go hard after crimes like child sex trafficking. But here's the other important principle. If Greenberg and Gaetz are in a conspiracy to commit sex trafficking violations together, it almost becomes irrelevant who the bigger fish is, because the law of conspiracy says every single conspirator is guilty of every crime of every other co-conspirator, whether you personally participated in those crimes or not. So listen, when it comes to child sex trafficking, it is all worth going after, regardless of how high up the food chain we end up going.
Right. That's a really good point. Now, if Gaetz is charged, I guess the difficult thing for me to imagine is a congressman getting hauled away to jail. Like, we've sat idly by and watched as Republicans have basically evaded accountability for 4 years, from Trump to his kids, Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue for stock trades. Like, we could go on all day. Is there any way that Gaetz would be able to avoid jail time if he's implicated in this?
Again, we have to wait to see what kind of charges he ultimately is indicted for. If he is indicted, do they have mandatory minimums? And if so, is there an escape valve, a way to get out from under the mandatory minimums? Because look, if they take down Gaetz, the first question is going to be, who can Gaetz give the federal prosecutors that might be above him in the food chain? Because you know what, he is not alone in the bench of bad Republican actors right now. So I suspect Matt Gaetz probably has quite a bit of information he can provide to federal authorities. And I know, Brian, what you say about we're so frustrated because of the lawlessness of the Trump administration has gone unaddressed. But I think the Bill Barr free ride is over. And with Merrick Garland in place, given how he came up through the Department of Justice, including my old U.S. Attorney's office in D.C., the man is a quiet storm, and the man is going to do right by the American people. I'm sure of it.
That's good to hear. And I do want to speak about, his role with regard to prosecuting those who were involved in the insurrection on January 6th. But I do want to stick with Gaetz for one quick sec. And that's to talk about one issue that I keep seeing pop up. And that's that Gaetz keeps deflecting by pointing to this alleged extortion attempt. But here's where I get lost. Even if he was the victim of an extortion attempt, that wouldn't absolve him of the alleged crime of trafficking, right? Like, it would just mean that separately there was one crime of trafficking and another crime of attempt extortion. So one doesn't make the other go away. So am I right to suggest that pointing to the extortion is just a way for him to muddy the waters?
You're absolutely right. And I don't even know that technically it was extortion. I mean, extortion basically for the layman is, pay me. Exactly. Pay me money or I will do X. And X could be, I could injure you. I could damage your reputation. I could damage your financial standing. So I don't even know. But the whole thing is a transparent diversionary tactic. You're exactly right. Even if somebody was extorting him, like, hey, I might just have to reveal that you're involved in child sex trafficking. Well, that doesn't absolve him of child sex trafficking. So this is all just a diversionary tactic.
Okay, that's what I thought. I mean, something that seems to be missing in all of this pointing to the extortion attempt is the or else. I mean, it just seems all we've seen thus far is that you have this person who Gaetz was pointing to issuing these threats, but there was never any or else. And so ultimately it's just somebody basically offering him money to make an alleged crime, to massage it or make it go away. It's basically he's selling PR. So I don't see where the extortion comes in there, but not exactly surprised that we would see him kind of scramble to make to muddy the waters here. Okay, so we've heard reporting that Gaetz asked Trump for a blanket pardon. Now, lawyers speaking on behalf of Gaetz have refuted that this happened at all, but let's assume, just for hypothetical purposes, that this did happen and that Trump did issue it. So A, is it possible that Trump issued it and that we don't know yet? And then B, when would we know that?
Yeah, so it's important to understand that there is nothing in the law and there is nothing in court precedent that says in order for a presidential pardon to be valid, it must be publicly disclosed. Hence the pocket pardon. As prosecutors, we grant something called pocket immunity all the time. We only reveal it when we need to reveal it, like when a witness invokes his or her right against self-incrimination on the stand and we have to deliver it. This is the same principle. He could have issued any number of pardons, and I would bet $1, which is my betting limit because I'm not a betting man. I would bet $1 all of his family members have pardons, and he has his own self-pardon, all of which will be susceptible to a court. But, I don't know whether he may have given Gaetz one or not. I find Gaetz' denials a little bit hollow. When we saw Gaetz go on TV and said, Donald Trump should give everybody a pardon. He should give congressmen a pardon. He should give Joe Exotic a pardon. He should pardon the Thanksgiving turkey. And yet we are to believe that Gaetz never asked for a little pardon of his own. Right. That's ridiculous. So let's assume he did. The question becomes, did Trump give him one? We won't know until Gaetz is charged. And if he has one, he'll pull it out and offer it in a motion to dismiss the charges against him because he'll say, I have a presidential pardon. But it's really important that I happen to believe the reporting that he asked for a pardon because the Supreme Court has told us what it means, what a pardon means when you are offered one, what a pardon means when you receive one. 1915 case of George Burdick versus the United States. George Burdick was a newspaper man in New York. He was the editor of the Tribune. President Woodrow Wilson issued him a pardon. George Burdick said, I don't want one because I'm not guilty of anything. And the Supreme Court said they upheld George Burdick's right to refuse a pardon. And they said a pardon carries with it an imputation of guilt, and accepting a pardon carries with it a confession of guilt. So let's just extend the rationale. Going after a pardon, requesting a pardon, coveting a pardon, I would argue by extension, if I were in court, equals an admission of guilt, a direct admission of guilt. So I predict that if push comes to shove, a court would probably rule that it's admissible evidence as both consciousness of guilt and an admission of guilt, which are two separate things, but they're related. It's admissible on the question of Matt Gaetz' guilt of the offenses. So this will all play out in the future when and if Matt Gaetz is charged.
Okay, well that answers, I think, all of my questions. So I do want to change topics here. I have a quick question about the issue of abortion. Now, there are a raft of states that are trying to pass bills effectively outlawing abortion. I know that we have Roe v. Wade, but is the goal just to try and get Roe v. Wade in front of the Supreme Court again? And aside from precedent, is there really anything stopping the Supreme Court from just overturning Roe if enough of the justices want to?
There is nothing from preventing a Supreme Court of revisiting its own precedent, and I fear they may do that. It's pretty transparent with some of these draconian abortion laws that are being crammed through Republican legislatures and signed into law. These are nothing more than a vehicle to try to get these issues back before the Supreme Court. Some of them seem laughable, so you would expect courts will strike them down. But with the composition of this Supreme Court, you never know. And thank goodness Joe Biden has just announced a commission to maybe up the number of justices, which I think is exactly what is required in this day and age. Of course, the Supreme Court historically has had as few as 5 justices, and it's had as many as 10 justices. I wish people would understand 9 is not a magic number or a constitutional number.
And by the way, we had 8 by virtue of the Republicans' own doing. They held that seat open for an entire year. So you have the exact same people who are, wailing about the sanctity of the number 9 on the Supreme Court, and yet it was them who made sure that we had 8 justices on the bench for the better part of a year because they wanted to block Merrick Garland himself from taking that seat. I do want to move over to January 6th, and this is what I was alluding to earlier. Now, is there any downside for prosecutors to add the charge of sedition for those who participated in the insurrection at the Capitol? And beyond that, is there any likelihood that those charges actually stick, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I retired from the DC U.S. Attorney's Office. That's where all my friends and former colleagues are handling the insurrection cases, and they're doing remarkable work, both the FBI and the assistant U.S. attorneys. I think a lot of the charges will stick, but I think the prosecutors have to make some really difficult tactical choices about who to plead out to relatively low-level charges, who to go hard after because we think they're part of a conspiracy and we want to work our way up the conspiracy. So, and all of this, I have to say, is part and parcel of resources issue, because we have a finite number of prosecutors, and I think they're doing the best they can, but they are somewhat overwhelmed. But I think they're going to make smart tactical calls about who to go hard after and who to maybe let go with relatively minor charges.
Now, this is overly simplistic, but what's the likelihood of any indictments and or arrests for the Republican officials who were involved in the incitement of insurrection at the Capitol?
So from a career prosecutor's perspective, I see criminal liability on behalf of Donald Trump, Don Jr., Giuliani, Mo Brooks, because in very real terms, they incited the attack on the Capitol. There's no two ways about it. But for this was a Donald Trump production, start to finish. But for him organizing it, orchestrating it, telling all of his supporters, come to DC on the 6th because it will be wild, right, lying to them, which is what provides the criminal mens rea, the guilty mind, the criminal intent, lying to them about the fact that their vote had been stolen, their election had been rigged, and their president had been wrongfully taken away from them. And you can stop it all right now by attacking the Capitol, by going down there and stopping the steal. You've got both corrupt intent and you've got the act, which was him pointing virtually a loaded gun, which was his riled up mob of a base at the Capitol, and pulling the trigger. And we saw the deadly results. Absolutely, Donald Trump has criminal liability. The only question is, do we have the political will to bring those charges? And if we don't, I contend we're slouching toward the end of our republic.
Well, that's a warning that I hope is well received. So, Glenn, with that said, where can my listeners and viewers find you?
So I'm on YouTube. I have a channel, just Justice Matters. Run my name, Glenn Kirschner, and I put a video up every single day, as I think do you, doing a legal analysis of the issues of the day in terms that hopefully people can understand and they can use in their everyday lives. You can find me on Twitter at Glenn Kirschner 2. I'm over on Patreon with Team Justice, where we've been building a number of grassroots citizen initiatives that we're working. So I'm trying to kind of spread myself all over social media, even though I still am learning what this social media thing is all about.
Well, you're doing a great service, and I completely agree that you're putting it, the importance of putting this in terms that people can understand. So Glenn, thanks so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Brian.